Up is on. Okay. I have the pleasure to moderate a panel again. We have 3 legislators from the Utah Legislature, all from fairly nearby surrounding areas, Representative Ward, Representative Lesser, and Senator Weiler. All are members of the Bipartisan Clean Air Caucus. And at least with Senator Ward or Representative Ward and Senator Weiler, we've talked for years about these issues. Representative Lesser, how long have you been in your seat? 4 terms. Okay, we have not yet worked together very much yet. Representative Lesser is also a CCL member. So let's start with just a little bit of personal intro, and then we'll get into legislation. Let's just find out who you are, where you represent, and a little bit else about your families and your lives.
We on? Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm Ray Ward. I represent Bountiful and West Bountiful in the House. In my other life, I'm a primary care physician in a private practice, full-time doing that. So I spend a lot of time working on healthcare issues. But I care a lot about energy issues as well. And I've enjoyed working with CCL in the past and still hope to.
Great. Am I live now? Great.
Yeah.
I'm Rosemary Lesser, and I actually where you're sitting right now is part of the area that I represent in the Utah Legislature. And my background is I was in Air Force, in the Air Force for 15 years, primarily as a physician, and then came to Utah where I welcomed about 6,000 babies here in the Weber County area. And it's a natural continuum that once you welcome new ones to the world, you want to create policy that makes it a better world for them to live in. And so that has brought my, although I'm like Representative Ward, very interested in health policy, in my mind, environmental policy is one of the most important things we can do for the future health of our world. So I'm glad to be here today.
So 2 doctors and a lawyer walk into a bar. I'm Todd Weiler. I'm a lawyer. My district is the state capitol itself up to about the Walmart in Centerville and then over to the Salt Lake Cemetery. And I've been serving for about 12 years. And I chair the Judiciary, Law Enforcement and Criminal Justice Standing Committee. And I've been working on the Social Services Budget Committee for for all 12 years. And I've been a co-chair of the Bipartisan Clean Air Caucus for about 10 years.
Were you one of the founders of it as well?
I was not. It started in the House, and as soon as it expanded from the House to the Senate, then I became a co-chair.
Okay. Couldn't remember the history. I know Patrice Arendt was one of the founders.
She was
immediately brought it Republican.
She's the godmother of the Clean Air Caucus.
Yeah. So I can't help but notice we have 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat on the stage, and we haven't had spontaneous combustion yet.
You know, we're not, I'm always telling people this, but we're not like Congress. About 90% or more of the bills that come to the floor of the House or the Senate pass unanimously or nearly unanimously. We often work with each other. We actually like each other. We're friends. It's not unusual to see a Republican sponsor in the House and a Democratic sponsor in the Senate or vice versa. I just want to, I'll stop where I started. We're not like Congress. We actually work together.
Is there a reason? Is it Utah? Is it Congress? Is there a way we could make Congress more like Utah? What's the problem over there in DC?
Well, I can't speak to the problems of DC, but in terms of positive things, I think one of the reasons that collaboration is structurally part of the Utah Legislature is all of our interim committees are combined committees. So, and the interim committees that will start again middle of May are really the times that we distill policy information. We get a lot of reports from state agencies, and those committees are blended with both the House and the Senate, and also with both parties. So we're working together in the policy space in the off season extensively. And I think that that's a really wonderful thing. And also a way that we get to work with the Senate And many legislative bodies don't have that type of collaboration with the opposite house.
In the legislature, there's about a 3-to-1 Republican majority, maybe even a little bit more in both bodies. So a more, I don't know, realpolitik or blunt answer would be if something is exactly a partisan issue, then it's really not an issue. It's not, it can't get out of rules. It can't pass a committee. So the issues that are going to be discussed, the issues that have people on both sides that you don't know how they're going to end up, are going to have something about them that makes them not a straight partisan issue. Just so I look over at my Democratic colleagues and see which ones of them I admire. Just say, looking at all the Democrats, who do I see as the most effective over there? And they're the ones that have figured out some way to work with the Republican majority, and the ones that just only want to be angry. That's a valid legislative strategy that we see on the national level, I guess. But then in the result is going to be that they're not going to get anything done here.
It does get you on TV.
Yeah, and I just want to add two things. I agree with everything my colleagues have said. I think part of the problem with Congress is the 24-hour cable news cycle. If during the Constitutional Convention, there had been leaks and, Fox News and MSNBC were reporting what George Washington had said, and they would never have arrived at the compromise that they did. And I don't mean that facetiously. I mean that it would have blown it up in a heartbeat. The second thing is because of political gerrymandering on both sides of the aisle, what we get accused of doing in Utah is like kids play when it comes to what happens in Illinois and some other states on the Democratic side. I think Congress is full of extremists on both sides. We have some extremists on both sides in the legislature, but they're the minority and they're not the majority.
That's been my sense as well. The overwhelming majority of members of the legislature are productive and solutions oriented. Representative Lesser, can you tell us what it's like to legislate in a super minority? Can you propose bills? Can you?
So the short answer of that is yes, we can propose bills, but Representative Ward actually led into this quite well by talking about the political realities of the numbers. But backing up, I wanted to also say that members of the Minority Caucus also participate in a number of different task forces through the course of mostly in the off season, and which we're looking at solutions. And I believe that there is a place for a diversity of opinions from not only within the Republican Party, but also within the Democratic Party. And we will be stronger as a state when we have diversity of opinion, and that should not necessarily cross party lines.
That is a wonderful point. I emailed all of you about legislation, some of which there was disagreement on among the three panelists. And I'll be looking forward to a productive conversation about those things, because we want to hear the pros and cons of these issues and not just be in an echo chamber. Senator Weiler, I emailed also that I might bring this up.
Yeah.
2018 Environmental Stewardship Resolution. We worked very hard on that. CCL worked very hard on that. Becky Edwards was the sponsor. You were the Senate floor sponsor. To me, that really opened the conversation on climate change in the Utah Legislature. Did you have conversations with your colleagues? Was that difficult?
It wasn't difficult. I'll tell you, I think it would have been difficult in 2012, which was my first session. And when I came into the Republican Majority Caucus in the Senate and started talking about clean air, a lot of my colleagues looked like, maybe I was in the wrong room. But that changed. I think that between 2012 and 2018, I think, my colleagues started to see that consistently, on the top 5 of Utah's concerns was clean air and other environmental issues. And so by 2018, I think the attitudes had hearts had softened, if you will. The attitudes has changed. I want to say one other thing. What we passed in 2018 was significant, even though it was just a resolution, so it didn't enact any policy change. But the most recent statement from the legislature a decade before that was basically that climate change and global warming is a hoax. And so just to get, kind of a reset on that attitude, on the record, which nobody looks at, but on the record is important. And kind of fun fact. So I was Becky Edwards' senator, and she was my representative in the House. And so, she's been replaced. Well, she didn't run, and then Melissa Ballard took her seat. But so that was kind of fun for us as well.
And I'll just share that watching this testimony, floor testimony in the Senate, I was in agony. I wanted you to downplay it.
Yeah.
And just let it slide under the radar. And you gave a passionate speech about how we needed to step up and tackle climate change. And then Democratic Senator Jim DeBackus spoke against it. And
Because it didn't go far enough.
because it didn't go far enough.
Jim's a good friend of mine. I think he lives in Mexico now, but I just want to, I think that's a point I want to share with all of you members. If you contact your state legislator, especially if they happen to be Republican like Ray and I are, and if you tell them that the world is coming to an end and that we have to stop driving our cars tomorrow and turn off our water heaters and our furnaces, you're not going to have an impact. So if you come across as an extremist, your representative, your senator, they're going to dismiss you. So the more practical, changing the legislature's mind is like turning around the Titanic. It's not going to happen on a dime. And so if you come in with a sky is falling, the world is ending tomorrow attitude, you're going to be dismissed. If you come in with some pragmatic, practical baby step solutions, you have a much better chance of being taken seriously.
That is really good for us to hear.
If I could just go backwards a minute to what the previous panel was talking about, I think that's an area that is just really so important. Starting in some areas where there is agreement is just very, very helpful. And talking about climate change is always difficult, because in my mind, it is completely true to say that there is absolutely nothing that you can do on a local level that by itself will change the global outcome. The global outcome will depend on the global amount of change that happens everywhere, not on the one thing that we do here. And that's just part of, it's different from clean air, right? I mean, if we change the pollution that we produce here locally, that can make a meaningful and observable difference. And climate change just is harder in that respect. But permitting reform and transmission of electricity, I hope, is something that we can agree on as 100% necessary to solve the overall larger problems that are larger than our state. They do go across the whole nation, and to get more people to come in and say, look, I have some concerns about NEPA reform. NEPA has defended some things that I wanted him to defend. But if each little thing that I want to defend can and does stop these larger projects from being built, then I'm willing to think about it differently. I'm willing to give up some of what's important to me in order to get these other projects done. That must be done. There will not be a solution if that transmission doesn't get put in place so that it works better. And when we get to where there's not enough transmission and people don't have enough energy locally, once that happens, their minds and hearts will be closed. Their top priority will be their energy locally, and the global situation will not matter. That's just how we operate. So I hope there's enough agreement there that we can, to me, that seems like a good place to start, to all say, we've got to make this happen to get the energy that we need.
I shared this morning when I spoke about national update that I thought that was our immediate best prospect for bipartisan legislation that would make a meaningful dent in emissions right now. I want to touch on one more thing from the past, and then we'll go to this year's legislation, and that's carbon pricing. I let some people down this morning when I said I don't see an immediate viable path to a carbon pricing bill. There are other things like permitting reform that are much more viable right now. You have, Representative Ward, you've been a carbon pricing supporter. You introduced a carbon pricing resolution.
Yeah. And
you were the first signer on a carbon pricing op-ed that ultimately attracted 25 Republicans.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that, the conversations on that topic with your colleagues?
I think that one of the things that I feel like needs to happen overall for different kinds of policies to pass the Utah Legislature eventually is for many of my other Republican colleagues to come to believe that climate change is a threat to their children and their grandchildren, that they don't believe that yet. And I don't know if they're closer than 5 years ago. There's so many issues get pushed off to the side and we get tied up in arguing about other things. And they're accusing the United Nations of this and that malfeasance, which may very well probably be true for all I know, but it distracts from even thinking about whether you believe that climate change is a threat to all of us. And to me, that discussion about carbon pricing is something that I hoped and I think did say, look, we need to talk about this again. If you don't think it's a threat, then I don't know why we're having any of these conversations. If you just think that it absolutely is unrelated, but to talk about the big picture and to say, even if this is a big idea, let's talk about a big idea that honors free market principles. If there's damage that comes from this, then let it pay its fair weight, and then once it pays its fair freight, then let the free market work it out. So I think that served an important purpose and an important part of the conversation, but we still need to have that conversation yet to win over hearts and minds as to whether that this is a really important issue for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that. I agree. Even though it didn't turn into legislation, I thought it played a very important role in the conversation and getting us to where we are now.
And let me just add, Utah and the Utah Legislature prides itself on being a business-friendly state. So when you have something like carbon pricing that is perceived as anti-business, it's going to struggle. And I had a conversation probably 11 years ago. My district includes the west side of North Salt Lake, which is the Redwood Road. It's a very industrial area. And I had a conversation that I've reflected on hundreds of times, and it was with a small business owner down there, and he had an industrial operation. And part of his operation, they would bring the equipment they were making outside and they would spray paint it. And he told me due to the EPA and other regulations, they had installed expensive buffers and they were now capturing about 97% of the vapes and the fumes that came off of those aerosol sprays. And he said, I was happy to do it. He said, if the government ever makes me go above 97%, it'll put me out of business. The pricing would, all of my employees lose their jobs, I shut down. And I think the reason I mentioned that is I'm happy pushing him up to 97%. If you ask me to push him to 98%, I'm going to vote no. And we've got to find those win-wins. Now, some of you might say this is ridiculous. He should be out of business. But the legislature is going to say, let's push up to that line, but not cross over it.
Yeah, excellent. Very well put. Thank you.
And of course, the $100,000 question or $100 billion question, though, is, where is, you talked about that individual putting controls up to 97%, but what if there is no control whatsoever? And that's one of the big problems that we're facing here. And one thing, just aligning with what Representative Ward was speaking about as far as what moves people, whether it's concern about future generations is one thing, but many legislators, including California, Oregon, and Washington, have made transparency requirements for the cost of energy to the individual, because you may not, and how that relates to climate change. So you may not care about, well, people do care, of course, about the outcome of the next generations, but whether or not you believe climate change is real, you will be affected by rate changes and energy policy changes and how it affects your bottom line, either as a ratepayer or as a business owner. And so for all my citizen climate lobby friends, basically pointing out the economic advantages of clean energy, I think is a winning message in a business-friendly state like Utah.
And I just want to add, and I hope most of you know this, but the majority of our electricity in the state is generated by coal, but that percentage goes down a little bit every year. And again, we're not going to turn around the Titanic on a dime, but you're going to see, I think that, in the next decade or two, the majority of electricity in the state will eventually be generated by renewables, but that's not something that's going to happen overnight. And so I think the good news is we're trending in the right direction, not maybe as quickly as some of you would prefer, but we are moving in the right direction.
Thank you. Yes, we are trying to accelerate it.
And I think in order, just saying we want to accelerate it all the time, there's legislation that comes through, and I've run legislation that says we're going to set a target. or we're going to make a goal, and a goal, whatever, without something that's enforceable, or when you don't know how much that is ultimately going to cost, it just seems less likely to me that ultimately will do what you hope it would do. If I were to think, what things do I think are underway right now that might make a big difference? I think it's transmission availability, so that other projects that already right now don't cost very much, but can't get their energy to where they need it. Oh, all of a sudden that becomes economically viable. That might make a difference. Having larger battery storage that was less costly would make a huge difference to the value of the renewable energy. Individual projects that are going on here in Utah is the IPP Renewed power plant that Mike Squires and his group have been working on to transition from a coal plant to a natural gas plant. And that is still a huge fight that happened in the legislature just recently and is not done yet. No one knows how that's going to turn out.
Well, we're coming back for a special session on that, May 14th, I think.
Yes, that
Yeah.
kind of is what I was hinting at. Maybe you know how that's going to turn out. I don't know how that's going to turn out just yet. But it is still underway, right? So that is one important step by itself to move from coal to natural gas. But that plant is the first plant that's being built with turbines to blend in hydrogen. And if you blend in some hydrogen and some natural gas, maybe you get a little bit of benefit, but you have to, that'll be the first plant that does that. And if that works well, then it will be cheaper the second time you build a plant like that. And if you have natural gas that over time, you can really transition to hydrogen, well, that's a whole new kind of power plant that can work for us. And the geothermal energy, Utah's putting in the first plant in the nation of that size. Yeah. And we don't know if that will be super expensive or about the same cost or way cheaper. Probably will be more expensive because you're building the first one, but until you build the first one and get your costs back, then you can't build the second and third and fourth. And so to have the first one up and running is a big, important step.
All right, that's a great segue into this year's legislative session. So we talked about touching on a couple of different areas. Climate legislation, there was nothing directly there, but there were some indirectly related resolutions. Great Salt Lake, clean air and clean energy bills, and coal. And I know the audience is going to want us to at least touch on coal, and we can do whatever else you would like to go to. So anybody want to pick one for what we should start with?
Well, we can start with coal. So as a legislator, I'm going to vote about 1,000 times every 45-day session. It's probably actually more like 1,100 times. I cannot be a subject matter expert on all of those topics. It's impossible. Nobody could be. And so I know a little bit about a lot of things. Most legislators, and this is an analogy I've been using for a decade, most legislators aren't willing to dig more than an inch or two deep on any given issue. If you dig 3 inches deep, then you become a subject matter expert in the legislature. If you dig 2 feet deep, then you're a weirdo. But anyway, so all I know about, my interest in coal, and Ray represents Bountiful as well. So there's 17 IPP or IPA cities in the state, and so they're partial owners of that plant that's been a coal plant for a generation or more. And that's the one that they're converting now because California is forcing them to. They're converting primarily to natural gas. So all I know is that my constituents in Bountiful were potentially going to have to pay a higher rate to try to keep that coal plant viable. And so I didn't want other legislators shifting the cost to my constituents. I don't happen to live in Bountiful. I live in Woods Cross, so I'm on Utah Power. So it doesn't affect my pocketbook, but my biggest city, the biggest portion of my district of any one city is Bountiful. And so I was up there trying to amend the bill, trying to kill the bill, because I didn't want the cost for keeping it open or viable or mothballed to be shifted to my constituents.
This was Senator Owens's bill?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And for whatever reason, it's a very emotional issue to him. He often starts crying about it when we talk about the bill, which is hard to have a rational conversation. He's a great guy. He's a smart guy, but it's a very emotional issue for him. And so I was able to get the majority of my Senate colleagues to vote for a substitute bill, which I felt would have much better protected my Bountiful constituents and the other constituents in the 16 other IPA cities, which are not in my district. Unfortunately, when the substitute bill went to the House, they kind of subbed it back to more, like what we were abandoning. And
I was not able to get the majority of my House colleagues to vote for that.
but yeah, and the bill that, I think ultimately passed, I've been told by several people, I'm not just patting myself on the back, was a little bit better because it was less bad because of my substitute. But it was still bad enough that the governor came, I think, about this close to vetoing it. And rather than vetoing it, he signed it with the understanding we'd come back in May in special session and try to fix it. But this is the thing. There's 104 legislators. None of us really know enough about this issue to be a subject matter expert. And I don't really want to. I mean, this is one of 591 bills passed. So I need to know enough that I need to know if I'm voting yes or no.
And
I
you could be a subject matter
yeah,
expert on family
I've
law.
got a real job, outside the legislature, and a family and a life. And so I don't have to be an expert. I just need to listen to the experts.
Right.
So
I did appreciate looking at your voting records on these bills. I appreciated that you voted yes and no on different versions of that bill. Like obviously thought was being put into what was acceptable and what was not. And just to refresh or to fill everyone else in, the main thing in my eyes that bill does is give the state the option to buy that power plant rather than have it demolished.
And I'll tell you two things about that power plant. Number one, the transmission lines, the big transmission line only runs to LA. And then there's a small transmission line that feeds back to these 17 Utah cities. And so like if it's 110 degrees in July, they can draw some power from that and not have to pay somebody else, 500% of what the power usually costs. And so that's the real benefit to those cities. So that's number one. So if we keep the coal plant open and create all of this power, it can only, 98.5% of it can only go to LA County, and they won't
And they
buy
don't
it.
want it.
Okay, so that's number one. Number two, there's a question of whether there's a market for coal or even enough coal, because we have two other coal plants that are struggling. And so, people are coming up with these ridiculous solutions. And so I've heard floated during the session, well, maybe we can get Facebook to locate, 3 or 4 data centers there, and then we can burn coal and just use that power for those data centers, because data centers take a lot of, so this is a lot of power. This is all pie in the sky. Facebook doesn't
want it
they don't
either.
want to be coal dependent. They don't want to have their plants in the middle of nowhere, 3.5 hours away from an airport, and so people are coming up with these ridiculous scenarios. Well, maybe if we do this, then, and of course, Senator Owens is trying to preserve those jobs, because the natural power facility will employ, I think, only 10% or so of the number of people that the coal plant does. And then I think there's change is hard for people, and so there's these people that just want to hug their coal and just, no, it's over my cold dead body sort of attitude. So we have a lot of rural Utahns in the legislature, and they're good people, but they're also 100% coal friendly. So
Yeah.
And they're correctly representing, I would say, the wishes of their constituents.
Yes.
yeah.
Right, which is
Well, at
a
least the
legislator's
majority.
primary job.
A majority of their constituents, but not all
Yeah,
of them.
right.
Yeah.
Right. And then the other coal bill, SB 224, Representative Ward, I watched your floor speech on that one, and I thought it was astounding. But extremely well stated. But for everybody's benefit, that bill flips the regulatory burden to the public to have to, it used to be the utility has to justify that their costs are reasonable, and that bill flips it for coal.
Yeah, so now an outside party who doesn't have access to the information of the cost, I mean, utilities are monopolies, and monopolies have power just by virtue of being a monopoly. You need that power, you have to have that power. So when they say, well, sorry, my cost just went up this much, it gets difficult to debate them. And we have our Public Service Commission that does a good job. I think it's the best system we've come up with to try and say, no, that and that, you just chose to do that. You can't charge more for that to try and keep their costs down. And now it will be up to an outside entity to try and challenge that if the coal winds up costing more. I don't know the future of that bill yet, right? I mean, I think to me, in the short term, I just want to see the new IPP plant up and running and doing well. To me, that's kind of like the top priority. Those other 2 large plants, Hunter and Huntington, that do provide most of our power right now, are not close to being shut at the end of their life right now. That is still a little ways off. But all these things are things that move it a little bit this way or a little bit this way, in that respect. I don't know what the next legislative step will be or the next change in the marketplace that says, oh, whoa, oh, that geothermal did way better than we thought it was going to do. We're going to build 2 more of those,
But one thing I forgot to mention on that transmission line running to LA, the big one, to build a new transmission line, you're talking about a decade of federal approvals and
At
a couple
least.
$1 billion.
Yeah.
So it's not like we can just put in a new transmission line and run it to Salt Lake or Boise or Denver.
Right.
It's not viable.
Although Texas has really leads the country in terms of putting transmission lines and overcoming that at the state level. So where there is will, I think there is a way in terms of the transmission lines. All of us recognize that that is really one of the keys to energy for the future. But, talking about things that are, Representative Ward's talk on the floor of the House was magnificent, I must say. And, he talked about the price of coal and so forth. But, one thing that is out of our control also, but was a component of this particular bill or the 244 or 224 had to do with fire mitigation.
Yes.
Because that has resulted in a change for the integrated resource plan for Rocky Mountain Power. And it's interesting because if you look at their most recent update, it says 2023 plan updated April 1st of 2024. And I think that that's something that we may want to talk about because the costs of litigation and payouts as a result of environmental actions that happen as a result of a power company have led to potentially more than $1 billion worth of exposure, specifically in Oregon, that has made somebody like Warren Buffett say, what am I doing in the world of energy altogether? And so I think that's something that we all need to consider, that there are forces outside of our control and involving the cost of litigation and fire mitigation.
And Rocky Mountain Power is now significantly backed off on their procurement of new clean energy.
Yes, right.
We don't know if it's in response, but
Well, if we
reasonable
want
to assume.
so if we want to back up a year, right? So it was just that IRP to say is a 20-year look into the future, and an update comes out every 2 years, right? So every 2 years you update your 20-year forward look. And the most recent one prior to this one that just came out last week was the one that put on a nuclear plant. And then everybody hoping for clean energy was cheering and happy about that. But that looked very different to the Utah legislative leadership. They felt like, and I think they're probably right, I don't know, they said, look, Rocky Mountain Power, Pacificor's board has a bunch of people on it who want non-carbon power, even if it costs more. And they said, we don't think that that really is their cheapest. We think it was their board members that pushed them to make that change. And their belief of that was part of why those coal bills were run in the session this year. And certainly, until something actually goes better with permitting, I don't know how you can say, anyone can say, oh yeah, I'm going to put in a new nuclear plant and get through the permitting process. UAMPS tried the hardest of anyone and made it the farthest of anyone. And they took 10 years and were still not anywhere close to actually getting their plant going. And that's why they had to give up on it. So that's why we need the reform on a national level so that that is actually viable instead of pie in the sky.
And that is why we work on that topic.
Yep.
Should we touch on Great Salt Lake before we go to questions from the audience? Because I know there's a bunch of interest in that subject as well. And you all, I think, know the bells better than I do. There were many of them.
Well, let me just start off by saying I have never seen an issue skyrocket from 0 to 100 in terms of the legislative concern about the Great Salt Lake like I have that issue. My first 9 years in the legislature, I don't recall a single conversation, a single text, or a single email about the Great Salt Lake. The last 3 years or 4 years, that's all I've heard about, including 2 different constituents in Bountiful. They're geniuses, I'm sure you'll agree, who said, why don't we just drain it and pave over it and build affordable housing out there? It's worth the consideration, but I'm teasing. I'm
Well,
being
our
sarcastic.
closing keynote will be
I'm-
on that topic.
I'm being sarcastic and facetious. However, I do think the legislature will do whatever it takes to save the Great Salt Lake. And right now we haven't taken draconian measures because Mother Nature has been very helpful the last two winters, including, this most recent one and even last night. But I think if we had to take more draconian measures, I think we will. But I think we'll be, you have to drag us kicking and screaming to those. But we have made some changes that I don't think are appreciated fully, maybe by everyone in this room. We've had 100-year policies that were designed to keep every drop of fresh water out of the lake that we've completely reversed. And those will not refill the Great Salt Lake on a dime. It's not going to happen. It took us about a decade to get as low as it was 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. And it may take us a decade to get it filled back up. And by the way, if you're not aware, the Great Salt Lake was almost as low as it was 2.5 years ago in the 60s and in the 30s, and it came back. But our population was a lot smaller back then, and I'm not unaware of that. But whatever we have to do, I think we will do. And I'm very, very grateful that Mother Nature is doing more than the legislature has. But one example of what we changed was we had, for the last 100 years or more, we had a use or lose it policy in water law. And that was if you went 7 years without using your water rights, then you lost them. They reverted to the states. We have reversed that. That change alone over the next 100 years will let billions of extra gallons flow into the Great Salt Lake. That's one change that we've made. We've done all the easy stuff. We haven't told everybody that they can't water the lawns. We haven't told all the alfalfa farmers that, they're out of business. And quite frankly, if we did do that, it wouldn't help the Great Salt Lake as much as the Salt Lake Tribune thinks it will, because most of those alfalfa hay is grown outside of the water basin that feeds into the Great Salt Lake. And while we're on hay, most of that hay is used in Utah. I know you've been told it's all shipped to China. A small percentage is shipped to China. Most of it's used in Utah. And every crop takes water. Last thing I'll say, the only reason we get 11% of the water out of the Colorado River Compact was because when that compact was formed 100 years ago, we were using, our farmers were using that much water. California farmers were using more, which is why they get more. If it wasn't for the farmers, we wouldn't have any water out of the Colorado River Compact. So don't make the farmers the enemies. They're the reason we have the water to start with. So.
Your point before about not being a subject matter expert is a place where the Great Salt Lake actually, the knowledge of people in that field has been shared with the legislature quite a bit. And starting with the Great Salt Lake Summit 2 years ago that Brad Wilson had, in which, Sierra Club, Audubon Society, Trout Unlimited, all of the stakeholders were there to inform people about things like Phragmites and how they suck up water. So and thanks to the work of people like you in the Citizens Climate Lobby, I think that almost all the legislators know more about flow into the Great Salt Lake than ever before. And so, the last 2 years, we've had programs like optimizing agricultural water use. And even though you spoke before, Senator Weiler, about this not necessarily being Wasatch Front, water scarcity in our arid state is relevant not only here in the Wasatch Front, but across the entire state. And so any initiatives that we do to save water, and this is actually a place where Democrats have had some movement as far as being able to craft good policies. My colleague Doug Owens had a great idea that was embraced by the entire legislature to, have split seasons for agricultural use. And this is an example of just working with the leaders in agriculture and saying, if you're coming to the end of the season, you're getting tired, how about if you sell the water to us? So I am really grateful for expanding our knowledge base in the Great Salt Lake, and it's due to people like the Citizens Climate Lobby, like the Great Salt Lake Collaborative reporting that has informed us. And as policymakers, that information is critical. Hearing what the scientists have to say is so important to good policy.
I guess speaking to what actually happened as far as legislation from this last session. So I had a bill that did not make it through at the last minute. The rural folks who sit on or that chair the different legislative water committees outside the legislature said, well, you didn't bring your bill to our committee 3 months ago. That was because the bill was not drafted 3 months ago. And that was enough reason for them to not to block it from going through, but I'll reopen it on the first day that I can open the bill files and I'll try again. And that one is just a reporting bill. It says of the $500 million that the state has committed to try and save water, some of that to help agriculture do better, and some of that to have enough water left to go to the lake, to get a reporting mechanism back to say, is the thing that we said we wanted from those programs actually happening? And if it's not happening, why not? Would there be a course correction? But until we even at least ask ourselves the question of all that money that we spent, if it's doing what we wanted, we can't really know if we're getting a good outcome. So I do hope that that will happen one way or the other. The two big bills that did pass, both were sponsored by leadership, one from the House and one from the Senate. The one in the Senate was sponsored by President Adams. And that bill, I think, did two things. It hired a position a person to think about if there would be ways long-term to get other water from outside the state. And short-term, that seems very difficult, but long-term, we should be thinking of everything. There's certainly some other places that have more water than us, and other places where maybe you could create water with a plant near the coast to desalinate in exchange for some water from the Colorado River. It would consider all those things. And the other thing in the bill, we've had our large water districts in the state that do kind of have ultimate authority over their individual water area. And this, I think, for the first time officially said, okay, look, you guys need to collaborate with each other, especially about instances in which we may need infrastructure that moves between those large water districts. There may be, easily will be, that we'll have a time come when one of those districts still has enough water and another one really, really is short. And if we can move the water there, we'll be better off.
And I want to make one last point if I could.
Please.
Can any of you in the crowd, I just want you to shout it out. What does a gallon of gas cost in Utah right now? $3.80. Okay. All right. Good for you. What does a gallon of milk cost in Utah right now? Anybody know? $3. Okay. And here's the question. Here's a question. What does a gallon of water cost in Utah?
Municipal or agricultural?
Either one. Nobody knows. You don't know, because as a state, we have hidden that cost from you. We put it in your property taxes. We put it all over the place, but none of you know when you turn on your faucet in your home, what you're paying for a gallon of water. That needs to change. If you knew it was costing you $1.50 a gallon as a taxpayer, you might take a shorter shower without us mandating it. So we've hidden that cost from you. I think you're going to see that change over the next decade.
And that's a great note for us to end on.